Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's Rev virtual session. The topic of our event is building a strong data science community led by Vince Stutenbeck from Red Hat. Vince, are you there? I'll hand over the reins.
I am here. Thank you, Karina. Hey, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining. Excited to be here to talk about this topic that's near and dear to my heart, as well as I think Red Hat's heart as well. And it's all about building a strong data science community and community building across the board. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the agenda here and what we're going to discuss this afternoon. I'm going to give you a little bit of background about myself and where the industries I've worked in and where I've had success in terms of building communities in this area. So talk a little bit about the macro shifts that have impacted organizational structures across the board over the past 20 years or so. Then we can shift into the organizational spectrum. It seems, generally speaking, that most folks are on one side of the spectrum or the other, but more and more I'm seeing in terms of the organizational spectrum, folks kind of migrating towards the middle, and I'll talk about that just a little bit. And I'll share some ways that I've seen some successes in terms of connecting teams and specific techniques that folks can use to bring folks together in a more systematic and consistent way. And I think this is even more relevant and important given the current circumstances that we're facing right now. And then we can transition to some questions and answer, and I'm happy to answer a few questions if there's time.
And really quick, I forgot to mention it in the first minute or so there, but everyone should see a Q&A chat box in the bottom of your screen. So if you have questions throughout the event, feel free to post them there, and we will get to as many as we can at the end.
Yes, thank you, Karina, for calling that out. Now, we haven't solved data science world hunger at Red Hat by any means, but again, I'll kind of share some of the strategies that we're using internally, as well as things I've learned across my 20-year career. You can see a little bit about my background here, the places where I've studied. I really kind of started out my career within the marketing track, and as I was getting started, the first 1 or 2 years out of school, my manager asked me, he's like, Vince, why should I give you this money for this marketing campaign? What's it gonna return in terms of a real dollar and investment return? And that question really captured me, and I went back to school a couple times and was really focused on trying to understand how we can do a better job of quantifying the effects of marketing efforts. And of course, what's core to that particular activity is using data. And so really fell in love with data and transitioned to more of an analyst / data scientist. And throughout graduate school, picked up some tools and techniques and learnings that I applied to my job in order to be able to use data in ways that I could build models and leverage that data for decision-making purposes. So transition from kind of a data scientist, very technical track, to a little bit more of a manager as I got further down and progressed into my career, into now really focusing on sort of higher level strategic type things, and still trying to keep some of my technical skills up to date when and where I can, but it's becoming increasingly hard, as you can imagine. So I spent a time across a wide variety of particular industries, and the advertising and media agencies you see on my resume, they give me an opportunity to work with a lot of different clients. And generally speaking, the rest of my background has been much more technology focused. And I do have a passion for technology, and it's amazing how much it's changed our working lives and even our personal lives across the board. Then on the far right-hand side, you can see a little bit of information about how I spend my time these days, and where I'm kind of digging in terms of data, and less of that actually on a pretty regular basis. So throughout the course of the past 20 years, you really see an increasing number of changes and different approaches and perspectives around organizational structures. And I think a lot of that's driven from increased pace of business, and which is definitely something within the last 10 years. You're seeing a tremendous amount of change around an intense focus around customer experience as well, and this is a good thing and a positive thing. I think it's certainly putting the consumer, whether that consumer is an actual person or a set of people within an organization, and you're in a B2B type of environment. There's a lot more of those entities being in the driver's seat in terms of purchasing and making decisions about next steps in certain areas. So the establishment of data science, the title, I think that came in around the late 2000s. So 2008, something around there. I think folks were credited with that. It's a really important step, as well as organizations tried to figure out, well, how do we organize and put this skill set? Do we put them all together in a centralized kind of way, or do we allow different teams to hire this skill set and use that role accordingly based upon their specific business needs, if you will? The explosion of big data and technologies, obviously, I think everybody's familiar with that, and certainly benefiting in some shape or form with respect to that particular trend. And it's certainly impacted how organizations have competed within the marketplace and structured their resources in a way that allows them to compete. Skill set scarcity as well is an important concept to consider here as we think about a 2019 LinkedIn study that basically ranked data scientists as the #1 most promising job, with a 56% increase in job openings from 2018 to 2019. So it still speaks to this idea that it's the sexiest job in this century, and still trending in the direction of increase versus decrease, which is really interesting. And lastly, but not least, of course, is something we're all dealing with, is an increased work from home type of scenario as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think that's, I know within our organization, that's having an impact, and folks are considering that as we try to connect a little bit better, as we try to replicate some of the things that we were able to achieve within an office setting in a more virtual type of setting, which is really important. So a lot of these overlap. Of course, some of them are interconnected in different ways, but I think they all have an important role to play in considering how do we build communities, and they certainly influence how organizations are structuring data science talent in recent times. So I felt like this was a really interesting point of view as we start to talk about organizational structures. The idea of connecting and aligning people to take on challenging endeavors is absolutely not a new concept. This proverb really highlights kind of the balance that needs to be achieved between a fully centralized model versus a fully decentralized model. And different organizational models bring about different strengths and weaknesses, and some of the factors I highlighted on the last slide, they really contribute to recent trends towards a little bit more of a decentralized approach. And that's enabling teams, and it's enabling organizations to adapt to some of the rapid changes, to take advantage of some of the new technological capabilities that are coming online these days. And I think that's an important concept to consider going forward as well. This is pulled from a Gartner perspective. They've done quite a bit of research and writing about the dichotomy of a fully centralized kind of view versus a decentralized kind of view. And so on the left-hand side, we have more of the control, the centralized point of view, offering things that are much more consistent and standardized, perhaps generally easier to gain some type of consensus towards a single goal with all that talent organized, versus the more freedom side on the right-hand side, which is offering more autonomy, agility, innovation, generally speaking. So Gartner actually advocates for a distributed hybrid organization model, which is a little bit of a mix between the two. And I think more and more companies are starting to figure out and try to understand what works best for them. And so they're on this journey to try and optimize this as time goes on and as folks try to figure out exactly what works best for them. In fact, McKinsey actually did some research that actually highlighted the fact that most models will work. It just depends on what your goal is, and as long as no function or business unit is actually left on an island by themselves. At Red Hat, we tend to skew heavily towards the right-hand side. Red Hat is a technology organization, a fast-growing technology organization. Still rather small, with slightly less than 15,000 employees. So when you think about our company and where we've been and the startup mentality that's still pretty prevalent across the organization, you'll definitely see us trending more on the right-hand side than on the left-hand side of control. So I'm going to focus the majority of the rest of the discussion around what it means to be more on the right-hand side of this, talking about the freedom and what that brings in terms of a set of challenges as well. So there's been some recent studies talking about the challenges related to scaling projects across functions. And, fewer than 20% of companies have actually achieved advanced analytics at scale, according to a recent McKinsey study. And then a lot of those projects don't get past the experiment phase in order to make that business impact that you would expect within a sort of a production version of that. And that's some research that Forbes came out with just this weekend. So lack of consistency is obviously something that, if you have data science talent sprinkled around organization and not on a central team, it's going to be a little bit more challenging to try to bring folks together and follow a consistent set of standards and guidelines. That's something that these types of org structures are going to lend themselves more towards. Higher than average talent attrition as well is something that I've seen across the board in these types of environments, as well as an enhanced sense of a single lack of source of truth. And this is the case where folks are pulling data from wherever they can, and they're executing on modeling projects, and they're trying to make an impact on the business as quickly as possible. And there's probably very high expectations. And as a result, you get more and more of this potential lack of a single source of truth. Not all the time, but it's certainly something that I've seen across the board in various organizations I've been. So the idea of the rest of this conversation is, how do we lower the cost associated with the bullets on the right-hand side through some community building and specific community building tactics? Before you get started, and maybe many folks on this discussion have already been down the path of starting to build communities, and it's more of an acceleration type of perspective. It's really, really important to consider a few things here about the environment in which you're taking on in terms of setting this up. So first of all, where does the talent lie within your organization? Is knowing and understanding where those folks are. They might have different roles. They might have different titles. They might not be called data scientists across the board, but they might be doing data science work. How do you find those folks? And then how do you connect them is one of the first steps in this process. Also, where have investments been made to date? Investments around technology, data consolidation, all types of data governance investments. Those are all really, really important things to consider and things that might be helpful to pulling together a community. Significant changes in competitive business environment. Sometimes bad things happen and or good things that would lend themselves to making it easier to start community building. And that could be something as significant as a pandemic, or it could be something that's just related to a specific product within a market. But either way, considering these changes might actually be beneficial to your efforts there. Some company cultures are perhaps more amenable to the idea of communities, cross-functional communities, groups of folks working together that don't necessarily interact on a regular basis. And that might be something. Red Hat is a very open culture. It's been written about pretty extensively, and it's part and parcel to how we operate and run on a daily basis. And then lastly, something to consider is data science maturity. In some industries, in some specific functions, there's actually an idea of the ability to mature things to a spot to where you're producing outputs that are making huge impacts and or you're not. And so the idea of understanding just how mature a specific function and or organization is and where you want to be is also another important consideration. Everybody's journey is going to be different, and there's no doubt that there's not going to be the exact same path for every single company and or person. So this is a summary of some of the approaches that we've taken and I've seen work across different areas. The first is around creating visibility, and I'll go into more details about each one of these. The second talks a little bit about skill sharing and mentoring and what that means in a more systematic way. Subject area joint projects, or community projects, as we sometimes call them at Red Hat, are another fantastic way to connect various teams. DevOps practices and consistency and developing ways in which are helpful to connect at a technical level across the organization are something important. And as well as common data science production environment and making sure that the expectations around what certain environments are used for is lastly one. And then finally, university connections, and that's something that we've been able to achieve within Red Hat in terms of working with some external universities. So a large part of these, and I'll speak to this as myself as well, are about getting introverts to engage. And so data science is a very introverted type of profession, and I absolutely am falling within that space as well. And so these are some of the ways in which that we can get folks to get to work together, if you will. So I'll start with this first one around creating visibility. So the act of just simply getting access to and understanding what is on other teams' docket in terms of what they're working on and what they've delivered recently is something that has worked quite well. At Red Hat, project show and tells are a regular monthly part of what we do. We have a community of practice of analytics and data science folks that are getting the really great opportunity to show off some of the great work that they've done and talk about how that work might be able to be leveraged within other areas as well. So that's the first thing. Common project management practices, linking teams to a common project management tool. And this is an area that is still in progress within our team within Red Hat, but it's something that is already starting to yield some positive results and starting to give visibility to folks and help them connect on specific topics of use. And Lastly is a searchable model catalog. And so the ability to not only as a practicing data scientist understand what's already been built, what's already available, what's already generating some type of impact within the business, but also from consumers of this too. This is a very important way that folks can start making sure that the models and the outputs that have been created are making an impact across wide swaths of the organization. Ultimately, too, it reduces redundancy, and that's another goal of ours in order to help folks get a little bit more coordinated. Skill sharing and mentoring. Ultimately, nobody really wants to feel like they're working on an island by themselves, and so connecting folks with similar skill sets and or helping them to build up complementary skill sets is something that we've taken more and more seriously within Red Hat. And so one of those things that we've talked about quite a bit, and I've seen work in other organizations, is just creating a skill listing by data scientists. And some of the skills get pretty technical in nature, whether they be NLP, whether they be some specific open source tool that's used for just one specific application. That information is super valuable, especially when we have folks that are looking to solve problems that might be complementary in nature. Setting some type of instant message channel for quick responses is something that we've done internally. And I've seen work in multiple places. Setting up, we use Google Chat, and Google Chat allows us to set up channels for specific projects and or just the ability to ping a larger group of associates on certain technical questions and get a very quick response is something that has worked quite well. Sharing a lead data science resource. We have a lead data science resource at Red Hat, and actually we had one at HP as well. And that person is really charged with helping to mentor and guide, serve as a methodological expert on many different subjects. And it's something that helps teams kind of work together more seamlessly, helps that person is often connecting dots and saying, hey, I didn't realize you were working on this. Did you know that someone in finance is working on something very similar? And being able to do that is something that this person does ultimately, as well as set up some of the consistent standards and guidelines across the organizations to reduce some of that friction, if you will. Mentorship programs, this is something that's talked about a lot, but the more that you can actually deliver on these things and help coach folks through their career and understand what their next steps is absolutely something that we've found to be a powerful tool and really helps various folks. And then training sessions. So we do lunch and learns on a fairly regular basis. We actually have several Red Hat data scientists also serving on university faculty, and such. They give pretty regular presentations. In fact, one just a couple weeks ago presented on random number generation. It was a lecture that they had provided at a university where they serve as faculty. So that sort of subject matter expertise and the ability to share that on a regular basis with folks is absolutely a culture building and value added activity that we encourage, and really has really helped our organization quite a bit. Ultimately, data science is a team sport, and this idea of a unicorn is really a challenging idea. And even if you're able to identify that unicorn, that person is so busy that they likely don't have a whole lot of time. So we think of data science very much as a team sport, and I feel like that concept has really gotten a lot of traction recently as well. Subject area joint projects. So this is an area that we've done quite a bit of work in at Red Hat. And the idea that there's cross-functional topics for your organization that would be mutually beneficial across the board is something that's driven a couple of projects. One specific project is with Red Hat being so focused on growth and trying to take advantage of the hybrid cloud open market. We've done several community projects. Several that are very focused on customer acquisition, identifying net new customers and cross-sell, and pulling from resources that work in product, they work in finance, they work in sales and marketing, in various areas of the organization to provide their perspective. And to this is something that's driven a tremendous amount of value, and is an active kind of community of folks that are contributing a tremendous amount of value to the organization overall. So these community-wide projects I've seen in the past get kicked off through some type of internal hackathon. And this is something that we did quite a bit at HP. We flew in folks for a week to focus on a very challenging product or project that hadn't been solved in a long time, really needed some time, attention, and focus from key members of the team. And we even gamified it, if you will, and created some incentives for teams to compete against each other in a way that ultimately spawned off a set of community projects afterwards. And lastly, one of the main success stories that we've seen of these is just creating that lockstep governance with IT and governance teams in order to make sure that the work that comes out of these cross-functional topics, these cross-functional projects actually deliver the value at scale and doesn't just benefit one particular functional area. So these subject areas ultimately can create this gravitational pull, if you will, for folks to get together and create something that can be leveraged not just within one functional unit or two functional units, but perhaps much broader across the organization. DevOps practices, something that's being written about quite a bit recently, and within Red Hat, we've started more and more creating peer reviews of code and methodology, and creating a set of structures to help folks shepherd what they've created into this idea of production. And we have a data science council of cross-functional data scientists, the most senior leaders of data scientists across the organization come together on a regular basis and evaluate models and review code and methodology, and they have a really important role to play in that. And ultimately, they have a role to play in managing resources that allow for the effective development, deployment, and monitoring of models. So it's really about, this whole area is about processes, establishing some consistent processes, if you will. And this ML or DevOps kind of idea is brings into really strong focus the idea that leveraging some of these processes can benefit all, and it helps folks reduce friction in terms of working together, helps them understand the expectations of what's needed to take a model from experiment all the way to some kind of test or pilot, all the way to production fully scaled, to where the organization is leaning on that model on a regular basis to help either generate additional revenue and or save costs in some form or fashion. So that's a really, really important part, and it's something that we're evolving quite a bit at Red Hat, and lots of folks have input into this process, but ultimately it's going to help us get a lot farther. So it's an exciting area for sure. Next is the common data science production environment. And this particular this is really, again, about setting expectations, and especially when it comes to the technology stack. Now, within Red Hat, we have focused most of our data science work within Domino, which is good. And in terms of other technologies we're leveraging, we're using Tableau and business objects and AWS quite heavily from a data warehousing perspective. And establishing, the idea of, certain environments and certain environments that contain higher standards and are used to support critical business processes and need to be monitored on a regular basis, need to be auditable should an audit actually be, introduced into the equation, but either externally or internally. Those things are super, super important, and they help with the scalability of the work, as you can imagine, and the business reliability expectation as well. Data sourcing is a key part of that, and for years and years, we've all been talking about single source of truth and everything related to that. And so the production environment helps set expectations around data sourcing where it makes sense. And it's a super, super important concept. And we have a data science council, as I mentioned earlier, and these folks also help to curate and steward this particular environment, and ultimately align on those expectations on what it means to be within this environment, and what the final expectations are. Those expectations are not only from a development perspective, but they should be relayed to the end consumers of this information as well, in terms of documentation, in terms of validation of outputs, and everything in between. There's a different standard that should be placed within this area. And then lastly, we have something that we talk about quite a bit, and that's university connections. And we've, at Red Hat, we've developed a really strong relationship with several universities, but one in particular, NC State, given that our headquarters is located right next to NC State, has turned out to be especially fruitful. And it's actually helped in terms of our teams connecting with similar groups of folks out externally as well. So in some of the areas that it's helped is, one is addressing skill gaps. And so there's certain specialized skills that you may not want or have enough work to hire specifically for that. One might be NLP, one might be, I don't know, there's a million different ones out there, but this is a certain area where we've been able to lean into NC State and a few professors there to help us address some of these skill gaps. Act as a final arbiter as well. If there's certain methodological questions and or approaches that are not necessarily aligning internally, there's some type of disagreement on some things, this is a potential opportunity to that university connections can help with as well. And then a shared recruiting pool. And this is an area where folks that we're looking to grow the team, and we've been growing our data science team quite a bit in the past few years. We've been able to share resumes, connect with certain professors that are teaching students, and get referrals and pass those referrals on amongst our team as well. So it really acts as that kind of common external resource and common perspective outside of the organization. So getting started on the journey, identifying where your company and organization stand today is just an absolute critical piece of the journey. So some companies and some organizations may be just starting out with hiring their first data scientists. Some may be generating models that represent a competitive advantage that businesses using every single day, and is generating, tangible and measurable outputs. And so wherever you are within that spectrum, communities can actually play a role in helping to deliver value in that. And so what we've learned at Red Hat and other places I've worked as well is that it does take substantial amount of time and effort to build these communities up and make them strong. It doesn't happen overnight. Success does take time and it take investment, but ultimately we've seen a lot of positive results come out of these types of investments, and ultimately these investments are investments in relationships, and getting coffee or a beer over a one-on-one is a huge part of that equation, if you will. So that is the summary of it, Karina. So do you want to open it up to Q&A?
Yes, we've gotten quite a few questions in here. You talked a bit about some of the technologies that you use. Are you able to share which tools in particular you use for project management and model cataloging?
Yeah, absolutely. Project management, generally speaking, we're trying to rally around Jira, and so that is something that the teams are jumping on board with quickly. There are a few other project management tools around, but the data science community at Red Hat has found that Jira to be the most user-friendly and just kind of fits within the workflows a little bit better than other tools. In terms of model cataloging, that's still a work in progress, but we're looking at several different areas. And the thing about model cataloging, and we did this at HP, is it doesn't have to be all that sophisticated. There's different ways you can do it. I feel like you can do it within Domino. I feel like you can do it within Excel spreadsheet. You can do it in Informatica. There's a lot of different tools out there for that, but ultimately I think it's connecting to internal resources and internal places of visibility for folks to easily see and understand what exists today is the key there.
Makes sense. And then another tools related question. You mentioned that you have a quick IM channel, but do you have a formal Q&A forum like a Red Hat Stack Overflow equivalent, so it's easier to search previous questions? And if so, what tool do you use?
Yes, we have an internal tool for that, internally developed tool for that. It is absolutely helpful and highly recommended, just to be able to keep that history and understanding of what questions were asked, and obviously build upon those and use that as a knowledge reservoir for the future. Yeah, highly do recommend something of that nature. The quick hitting kind of IM instant message type of thing is what I found tends to be the first place people tend to go, just because it's easier, and they want the answer right away, and they don't have to spend time digging through historical things. And also, if you feel comfortable in some of the folks that you work with, and you've got relationships there, it can become just an easier way sometimes.
Yes. How do you develop best practices and enforce consistency of data science on the use of data sets that are widely used across the company by multiple different data science teams? For example, how do you prevent variance in data pre-processing on common data sets that would be used by the various teams?
Yeah, so we work closely, like hand in glove, with our governance organization, and we've developed concepts and around different data elements that are what we've called certified. And so it's absolutely, we're still a little bit on the early side of that journey, but this is how we're attacking that problem, is through certification with our governance teams. And our governance team will certify things that range from a dashboard output to a model or a data set can be certified, as well as a set of terms and definitions. It's really fascinating, and actually I see it on a regular basis how challenging it can be to define something as simple as a customer or a product. There's so many different variations of that, but when you have documentation and a group of folks that have agreed upon to say, hey, this is our definition of an active customer. This is our definition of a dormant customer, and it's this X, Y, and Z using these fields, then that helps address that. Now, with the freedom of a more decentralized organization, yeah, I think it becomes even more important that those governance components are there and they are represented in a strong fashion. And it's something that recently Red Hat has really invested in heavily, and we're making very, very strong strides in that particular area on a regular basis.
Yeah, especially I remember from experience defining a customer when you have both open source and proprietary technologies, it gets even more complicated.
Yes, exactly.
You talked about the challenges in a freedom culture. Can you also talk about the benefits and the value to the business in this approach?
Absolutely. So, as you can imagine, a lot of smaller companies and a lot of companies that are new to data science are taking more of a decentralized freedom approach. And so the agility that you get with that is absolutely unparalleled, as well as the closeness to the business and the understanding and the responsiveness to business problems and the outputs therein. So those are some of the key sort of benefits to that typical that specific approach. But I've seen other benefits as well in terms of just the creativeness that comes when provided with a specific problem that maybe other folks haven't had time to think about. There are and I think the speed to market and the overall rapid pace of change recently has really led folks to kind of trend toward that for sure. But more and more, as a lot of these studies are coming out and folks are starting to question the investments in data science and analytics and data, I've seen a little bit more of a trend slightly towards the middle. I wouldn't say fully centralized, but just slightly toward the middle in order to try and get a greater return on investment when you think about like scaling some of that work to a greater number of users. So that's what I've seen so far.
Yeah, makes sense. Kind of a related topic, can you talk about how to interact with your company leadership in a coherent way when the data science team is distributed or non-centralized?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is for sure a work in progress across Red Hat, and we have a few senior leaders that have increasingly come together in discussions about the investments being made across various areas within from a data science perspective, and what the expectations are in terms of growing those teams, and what is what the organization at an enterprise level is looking for in order to become that model-driven or algorithm-driven or data-driven organization. And so senior leadership buy-in and understanding of what the outcomes are that are expected, in my opinion, is hugely important. And more the Data Science Council and some of these formal groups that have formed within Red Hat are starting to pull together a point of view that is shared with senior leaders. I wouldn't say it's perfect, like I said, I wouldn't say we've solved everything yet, but that's happening on a more and more consistent basis. And I think on a regular basis, it helps for leaders to understand how folks are working together and how the organization at a macro level is benefiting from this investment.
Absolutely. How do you manage job titles across the community and building out career tracks for the various roles?
Yes, very, very important. At Red Hat, this was done at a grassroots level, and actually at HP, it was done at a grassroots level as well, where a group of folks got together and said, "Hey, we absolutely need to start establishing establishing consistent job titles and roles across the organization, and work with our people team, our human resources team, to implement those." And that's what happened. It was very much a sort of grassroots type of initiative, and we looked externally as well for validation of some of those decisions that were made around the roles, and I would say it's a hugely important component to this. And whether you're a data analyst that's doing some data science, and or a financial manager that's doing some data science, just the the ability to quantify exactly what the data science role is, and help folks that are in that track to be able to understand what their next step is super important. Like I said, it was generated at Red Hat and HP from the ground up, and we work closely with human resources to get that implemented in terms of leveling and job descriptions and everything in between. So, and very recently, actually, for both companies.
Interesting. Do you have any strategies overcoming an organizational knowledge gap when it comes to modeling methodology, descriptive statistics, distribution analysis of results, etc.?
Yes, some suggestions. I wouldn't say there's a silver bullet for it, but suggestions would be some of the knowledge sharing training that I mentioned earlier, where at least within Red Hat, we have several data scientists that serve as adjunct faculty on universities. They are actively sharing their lectures internally at Red Hat that they are sharing externally with universities. As part of that as well, that lead data scientist role that can serve as a methodological subject matter expert, can help with that, I believe, as well. As the last thought and the way I've seen this addressed is through some type of council, of cross-functional council, that helps understand the gaps that certain functional areas and or the entire organization might have from a skill and a knowledge perspective. So yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways to attack that. One's a little bit more community driven. One's the actual like appointee of a lead data scientist to kind of come in and help drive that agenda, as well as more of a kind of a grassroots kind of sharing information, sharing lectures, and subject matter expertise is three ways I think folks can address some of those things.
All right. In a data product focused work environment, how have you managed conflict from product managers that do not fully understand the probabilistic nature of data science as against the deterministic nature of software engineering?
Yeah,
Did
this
we get
is this is a struggle in lots of places, and we, being a software company, we certainly struggle with that too. Ultimately, data science has to be a place where failures can happen. It has to be a safe place for that. Not all projects, result necessarily in 100% probable and positive outcomes. And so that experimental understanding has to occur. And the more I think folks can come to the table and talk about that expectation, the better. Because what I've seen is folks just get in one camp or the other, and they kind of just lock down and dig in their heels, and it becomes a non-productive type of situation. So with that said, I think there needs to be open and honest dialogue about the experimental nature of data science, and that needs to be proactively discussed about about that particular aspect of the profession. And again, it could be a situation where an external perspective might help lend a hand in some cases. In fact, NC State, in our case, has helped us on that a couple of times. Actually, just providing that external perspective about the overall experimental sort of nature of data science, and helping to set expectations with folks that might not come from that background. Is that helpful? I know it's not probably a silver bullet, but.
Yeah, and then so I think we're gonna jump into our next question now. Do you know any of the examples of companies that have a successful hybrid freedom centralized model today?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. So I would say Red Hat is one of those companies, and it's an organization that has experienced a tremendous amount of success with the right-hand side of that spectrum being on the freedom side. And there's other organizations as well that I've spoken with in the past that are absolutely on that side and are experiencing tremendous success in those areas. And some of those are more focused within the sort of certain industries that might lend themselves to that type of startup mentality. Industries like consulting and maybe smaller startups, generally speaking. I've seen it work in a couple areas, but there's other factors to consider as an organization matures, as an organization has to react to certain market conditions that might lend themselves to needing less of that freedom and needing more of the scalability and focused understanding of what is the value being driven out of the analytical and data science outputs.
We still have a couple more questions, so let's jump into the next one. What are your thoughts about decentralizing data science in a company with a mature centralized data science team with established processes and best practices in place?
Yeah, it could be a really good opportunity to perhaps drive in some additional agility, some additional innovation, but perhaps hang on to some of those standards and some of those benefits you get of the centralized organization. Depends on what the organization is looking to achieve ultimately. Are you looking for additional agility, freedom, and innovation, and business understanding, further greater integration of analytical data science outputs into business processes and getting folks, data science talent, a little closer to the business? Those are all reasons I think that could make sense, and there might be ways to approach that without necessarily blowing things up, if you will, but taking a very systematic and thoughtful and controlled approach to doing that, perhaps within one or two functional areas, to see how it works temporarily and to see if it drives the type of outcomes that you're looking for. So yeah, I think it's an interesting question and an interesting place to be in, but there could be some value in terms of moving to more decentralized, for sure.
All right, so we'll do one more. Hi, Red Hat. How much data science has influenced the type of teams that are built in Red Hat, given that Red Hat is hugely focused on an open source and as well as production software?
Yes. So Red Hat has a tremendous desire to be data-driven and to be model-driven. So many teams across the organization have hired data scientists in some form or fashion or another. And so that has led to that freedom side, like I mentioned earlier, and the the goal of many managers to infuse data in a lot of the products, a lot of the services, the offerings, and the customer experience and everything in between. So it absolutely plays a critical role. And, our company has been growing quite significantly in the past few years. And so you'll see that the growth and investment made in data science has also been in line with that overall growth. So yeah, but like I said, it's leaned a lot more towards the freedom component, and so communities has been the mechanism in which we've been able to connect these folks and generate higher grade and more scalable type of outputs.
Fantastic. Well, we are going to go ahead and wrap up things here. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Vince, for hosting, and we hope you can all join us next time.